Going to be looking at the modern historian debate on the characters of the emperors, and we're exploring whether these emperors live up to their stereotypical images of Tiberius as a tyrant, Gaius mad, Claudius a weak emperor dominated by his wives and freedmen, and Nero as a lunatic. We're going to be exploring Gaius in this quick clip. And a modern historian might be most likely to represent Gaius as this insane emperor. And really, what we've got to be doing is we've got to be using our ancient sources to support or challenge, or even both, the modern historian and their interpretation about Gaius's character. So we'll start off with the typical quotes that kind of sum up our perception of Gaius as this mad emperor. So let's look at those first Suetonius quotes that kind of summarize this as Gaius as a lunatic. Suetonius gives us this. He says, quotes attributed to Gaius make him feel that he is dying when he's torturing somebody. Let them hate me so long as they fear me. And when talking about the plebs and the people of Rome, wish you all Romans had only one neck so we could get rid of them all in one blow. The important thing, though, about Suetonius and his coverage of Gaius is that hidden in the coverage, there are some actual positives, and particularly our perception of Gaius as a result of historians like Suetonius does kind of ignore the real positive atmosphere that surrounded Gaius's accession. And we get a little bit of this in Suetonius verse 13 and 14 on the positive start for Gaius and his reign. And mainly that's because he was the son of Germanicus, this big hero whose life had been tragically cut short in the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and Tiberius had been suspected of complicity in that, certainly by Germanicus's wife, Agrippina. And remember, Gaius's family had been pretty much wiped out. So there was a lot of sympathy for him as a result of their memory of Germanicus, but also the fact that he just wasn't Tiberius. So Suetonius tells us that his accession was a dream come true. Romans were overjoyed. And importantly, the Senate actually ignored Tiberius's will, because Gaius was supposed to be joint emperor with Tiberius's grandson. So the Senate actually ignored that, cue mass celebrations, and a whopping 160,000 animals sacrificed in 3 months. So we've actually got this positive start, and then we know that Gaius falls ill, and supposedly on his recovery, he's a completely changed character. And we get that negativity and that tyranny also from Suetonius. So not far on, in verse 27 to 33, we've got the feeding of criminals to wild beasts, parents attending executions of the sons, said grandson and brother Tiberius Gemellus is supposedly executed. His sister's banished when he's not having incest with them. Just whole-scale executions and torture. And in verse 37, some examples of the luxury and depravity and debauchery of Gaius's reign. So you've got these pearls dissolved in vinegar, and the discussion of the galleys, and these luxurious pleasure boats that Gaius had been commissioning. Essentially, he gets through all of the money that good old Scrooge Tiberius had amassed. Now, the important thing with Gaius is that he is often lambasted for his attitude towards divinity. And a modern historian and an interpretation question on this will probably touch on this issue of divinity. It might actually be the main focus of the interpretation. Now, when it comes to Gaius and divinity, we can see from coverage from Suetonius that he is absolutely pushing this idea that he is a divine being, that he is a god. Remember, Augustus had been reasonably conservative about that, certainly in Italy itself and in Rome. Outside and in the East, it's maybe a slightly different kettle of fish. Tiberius, from what you can see in evidence such as the Githyon decree, is again pretty reluctant. Whereas Gaius is absolutely really pushing this. Now, is this, though, actually more of a result in the fact that he's unable to match senators in their political experience and status? Do remember, of course, that Augustus and Tiberius had become princeps as experienced members of the Senate with authority. Augustus, or then Octavian, had returned after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, and Tiberius, in his 50s, was already a highly successful Roman general and political figure. Gaius doesn't really have any of that authority. So is this why he goes down the issue, the divine route and divinity route, a way to assert his superior status to the senators? And we can see lots of glimpses of that in Suetonius verse 22, when you've got the remodeling of the palace to incorporate temples to his own divine spirit, appearing actually as a god or demigod, his sexual promiscuity and incest supposedly to rival the Olympians, actually when he starts talking to Jupiter. And do remember, of course, that he claims that Jupiter and himself are the fathers of his daughter. Now, Suetonius is also corroborated by our other writers. So we've also got other historians that do discuss Gaius's divinity and his tyranny. So we have Cassius Dio, we've got Josephus, and we've got Seneca. But of course, the important thing is to consider that all of our sources on Gaius have their own particular agenda and biases and attitudes. So Suetonius and Dio certainly writing from a senatorial perspective, and far later, of course. So Suetonius and Dio much later than Gaius. Josephus, who, like Seneca, is much closer to the time, he is perhaps wanting to highlight the depravities of the Julio-Claudians as a contrast to the Flavians. And Seneca, of course, is trying to instruct Nero in how not to be a tyrant like Gaius. So let's have a little look, first of all, at what Seneca says. Now, Seneca really does highlight Gaius's arrogance, the idea that he loves cruelties, they're his bread and butter, and there's some pretty gross stuff Seneca is talking about when he's talking on in the pamphlet on anger. It's worth considering the arrogance which accompanied his cruelty. He was a mad beast, brutalities, his daily bread and butter. The idea that he works day and night and long hours for these cruelties, and there's even the discussion that even executed and rather dying men are not even allowed to cry out. They have sponges forced down their throats to gag them. So even in death, these men aren't even allowed the freedom to express the pain that they're in. So what a tyrant Gaius is. Josephus is pretty similar in talking about the cruelty and depravity of Gaius's reign. He aimed at becoming a living god. Gaius's madness was now an offense to God and man. He showed it not only in his sacrilegious conduct towards the Jews in Jerusalem and all the surrounding territory, but also exported it to infect every land and sea which was subject to the rule of Rome. And finally, Dio also talks about Gaius's madness. So Gaius and his pursuit of divinity and his lunacy is backed up by Dio, Josephus, by Seneca, and by Suetonius. So here we've got Cassius Dio's views on it. Of course, that's not Dio, that's actually a cheeky Commodus. But what does Dio talk about? Well, he's really highlighting Gaius's ambiguity, his insanity, and his bloodthirstiness. But do remember that Dio is a much later source. He talks about how he sets up a temple in Rome granted by the Senate. It's also the story about his horse, this time becoming a priest, not supposedly when he says that his horse could be a senator or a consul. And what is Dio talking about? Well, he talks about how he's contrary in all respects. He surpassed Tiberius's licentiousness and bloodthirstiness. He was ambiguous with the Senate, so they didn't know where they stood. And also, at the start of his reign, he forbids setting up of images himself, but later on acts as a god with temples and sacrifices. So Dio talks about this ambiguity of Gaius. So we've got four hostile sources. We've got Suetonius, we've got Seneca, we've got Josephus, and we've got Dio. But the important point to consider with Gaius is that all of these sources are writing from a pretty much aristocratic point of view. We don't really have any material that really talks about how the people feel towards Gaius and the vast majority of the people of Rome. A lot of these sources are really focusing on Gaius's slights to the Senate, but also traditional Roman values. But we do get a little glimpse of that in Josephus's coverage of the aftermath of Gaius's assassination. And in the aftermath of Gaius's assassination, there is an attempt by the Senate to restore the Republic. And they are having a debate, an argument, a conflict with the groups that actually don't want the Republic to come back in its true form. And that's the army and the people. And even in Josephus, who gives us some pretty blanket negative coverage of Gaius, we see this little quote about that. And it's really emphasizing the fact that the people actually preferred living under the emperors. The people, on the other hand, had no love for the Senate and realized that the emperors acted as a curb for its rapacity and were a source of protection for themselves. So it's noteworthy that in the occasional little glimpse that we get of the people and their attitude towards Gaius, they don't seem nearly as hostile to the idea of an emperor, and in particular, this emperor. He can't have been that bad if they're wanting another emperor. The Senate, and certainly historians that are sympathetic towards the Senate, seem much more critical and much more hostile towards Gaius than the people in the army likely were.